A number of African countries have dropped subsidies on fuel, triggering debate on the timing and merit of their action. Angola had some of the highest fuel subsidies in Africa, and their removal resulted in fuel prices almost doubling. President Tinubu's announcement that Nigeria's fuel subsidies would be scrapped led to a steep rise in fuel prices and widespread panic buying. The immediate consequence of the removal of fuel subsidies has been a hike in fuel costs and a further rise in the cost of living. This week on the program, we examine the pros and cons of fuel subsidies and the consequences of their removal. We also explore possible alternative economic measures governments may put in place to bring down the cost of living. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. In the last few years, more African countries have scrapped their fuel subsidies. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague Robert Negila takes a look at the cost of these subsidies to some countries across the continent.
Crippling debt, a surge in borrowing costs, and high fuel prices are forcing African countries to rethink costly fuel subsidies. In January, the government of Senegal announced a phased withdrawal of subsidies in the energy sector by 2025. Fuel and electricity subsidies accounted for about 4% of the country's GDP. In March this year, the Ghana National Petroleum Authority announced the country had already implemented regulatory measures, including the removal of fuel subsidies, to ensure stability across the downstream sector. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu announced in May the end of fuel subsidies in the oil-rich nation. In 2022 alone, Nigeria spent $10 billion capping the price of fuel. The World Bank estimates that subsidy removal and scrapping foreign exchange controls will save Nigeria $27 billion between 2023 to 2025. Further south in Angola, the Ministry of Finance tabled a proposal in June for a phased reduction of fuel subsidies beginning in the second quarter of 2023 to 2025. The ministry blamed fuel subsidies for negatively impacting public finances. Angola spent $2.3 billion on fuel subsidies in 2022 alone, accounting more than 40% of what the IMF estimated it spent on social programs. And in September last year, Kenya ended the fuel subsidy program. Kenya's President William Ruto said the government had spent $1.4 billion in fuel subsidies. Zambia, meanwhile, withdrew fuel subsidies in 2021, part of an agreement with the IMF that saw subsidy spending fall from 2.4% of GDP in 2021 to 0.4% in 2022.
Now, the big question is to subsidize or not to subsidize. Joining me to examine the pros and cons of fuel subsidies in Africa are from Bournemouth in the UK, Edwin Ikworia, an international development and policy advocacy expert. From Johannesburg, Kanyisa Fika, economist with Alexander Forbes Investment. And in Nairobi, Dr. Job Omagwa, an economist and lecturer at the Kenyatta University School of Business. Welcome everyone to the program. Kanyisa, if I may start off with you, over half the countries in sub-Saharan Africa subsidize fuel to protect consumers. What are the main objectives and rationale behind implementing fuel subsidies in African countries? Why were they put in place initially?
So I think the rationale, or rather by design, fuel subsidies are meant to be a short-term alleviation, and that is to cushion economies from a downturn and allow them to be able to find their feet in order to recover. But mainly fuel subsidies also support consumers in the sense that a lot of the production in Africa still happens in or energy intensive sectors. And by having a subsidy, you're able to reduce the price that people actually pay for goods and services, and also transportation costs to get to work and also to transport those goods. And that, I think, that is the main reason of keeping a fuel subsidy. And also it maintains manageable inflation or reduces inflationary pressures and allows consumers to continue to have strong purchasing power.
So, Kanyisa, there may have been a short-term solution, but if you look at countries such as Nigeria or Kenya, Angola, the Nigerian fuel subsidies have been in place since the 70s. Kenya's fuel subsidies since like 2008. So they're not really been a short-term solution for African countries. Why is that?
I think then it becomes a political play because you want your economy to be self-sufficient, and you want governments to have fiscal space to be able to use those subsidies in a sense that would diversify the economies. And I think the reason why you find countries that have had it for longer than necessary, for example, have struggled to be able to remove it. And I think it boils down to how it is then communicated. For example, during the severe stages of the pandemic in 2020, South Africa, as those fuel prices started hiking quite rapidly, implemented this short-term fuel levy subsidy. And in that sense, it was communicated that, the government had significant revenue overruns, that it could actually support this move. And I think that communication was important because then consumers didn't have to then think government would have this subsidy for a long term. And I think in that preparation, by the time the levy subsidy ended,
right,
everyone else was aware that that was done. But if it's a political game, then it does become quite challenging to remove, and then you kind of have to have communication and have a gradual phase out in order for the economy to be sustainably comfortable to actually take that blow.
Edwin, let me get your view here. Should there be fuel subsidies or should they be removed?
Okay, I would say the answer, it depends. It depends on the context. It depends on the situation. It depends on the fiscal strength of the countries. Fuel subsidies, or not just fuel subsidies, subsidies generally have been used by many governments across the world, globally, into the rich countries, the poor countries. Basically, like Kanisa said, is to cushion the impact of volatility, right? So especially for fuel, because the international market price for crude goes up and down, you really want to give stability to your people. And so you provide a subsidy as, in case intentionally will have been short term, but over time it has become a political tool, because when people get used to a particular thing, if you remove it, and then it becomes really hard for people to adjust, and then so the debate begins to happen. But I would say fuel subsidy are not meant to be normal. They're meant to help to cushion the impact of volatility and prices, and in that sense, you can't say it is good or bad, depending on your goal and depending on whether you can afford it. So, can you afford subsidies? If you cannot afford it, then it has to go. But if you can afford it, by all means, give it to the people, because ultimately, the ultimate aim of government is for the benefit of the people. So, if it will be there and it can provide means for the people to survive,
right,
to weather a very terrible storm, then it can have its better impact.
Dr. Omagwa, your thoughts?
Yeah, I similarly agree with the two panelists that subsidies could be good, and to some extent they could also be bad. The cost implications are far-reaching, but at the same time, governments need to get into these fuel subsidies as a way of achieving other economic goals besides the political dimension. Indirectly, some countries will engage fuel subsidies to also improve on the disposable income of its citizens. The amount of money that eventually remains in their pockets is what really matters to an individual who earns income, pays taxes, and other statutory deductions. So subsidies may be good, but at the same time, we need to have them on a temporary basis. For countries that have extended these subsidies for a very long time, it could be because of the political dimension that they want to remain popular. It is very unpopular for citizens to find inflation biting into their pockets. So most countries would always seek to maintain these subsidies as a way of remaining politically correct with the citizens, especially when they know that they are getting into re-election soon thereafter. But at the same time, the sustainability of this subsidy is another question altogether. Most of the developing countries are experiencing budget deficits. So to push that burden further with subsidies is a thing that takes them out of the trajectory of economic growth.
So, Dr. Omagwa, you mentioned that sometimes subsidies have been used as a political tool, particularly in the run-up to general elections. I want to look at the Kenyan example here because Kenya's President William Ruto did talk about the subsidies when he talked about removing subsidies from the Kenyan economy. And he said subsidies have been costly and they are prone to abuse. What is Kenya's situation?
Yeah, that is very true, that the cost implications on the Kenyan case, for instance, is quite colossal because evidence indicates that the country has spent about 144 billion Kenyan shillings on fuel subsidies alone. And in a space of 4 months to the run-up of the end of this particular subsidy, the country spent about 60 billion Kenyan shillings on the fuel subsidies. So the removal of the fuel subsidies, in my opinion, in the Kenyan case was justified on the premise that, one, the country was not being in a financially stable position to continue providing this subsidy, considering that in the 2023-2024 Kenyan budgets, the country has a deficit of about 718 billion Kenyan shillings. So to add to that pain will be continue with this particular subsidy. Now, the Kenyan government had to find a solution because it had to engage United Arab Emirates for a government-to-government arrangement to import fuel for Kenya in a scenario where at least 3 oil marketing companies in the United Arab Emirates, which are state-owned, would identify one oil marketing firm in Kenya whom they would engage to procure oil for the country on credit to be paid up within 180 days. Previously, in the previous arrangement, the oil marketing firm that won the tender to procure the oil, the fuel on behalf of the country would only have 5 days to clear up that particular debt. So there was also a very major strain on the foreign exchange reserves of Kenya. The dollars were becoming very scarce as time went by, and the country had to make a decision to move away from the subsidies and opt for an alternative arrangement, which will be to procure through a different option.
So let me look at Nigeria's scenario as well, Edwin, because the fuel subsidies there go back to the 1970s. And Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu called the move there a necessary sacrifice. Do take us through the primary arguments for removing the fuel subsidy in Nigeria.
I think it's exactly the same thing for all African countries. The one that Dr. Job just talked about in Kenya, it's exactly the same thing. The bills are just unsustainable. It's just not possible anymore. What do I mean by that? Nigeria spent in 2022 96.3% of its revenues on debt service. I need you to think about that number. So for all the monies, all the revenues that was accruing to the government of Nigeria in 2022, 96% of it was spent to service debt. That is the situation. So within that situation, it doesn't make economic sense to continue to borrow to feed consumption. That was the primary argument, because it was not just, the money was not just there. It is not, basically you're borrowing to do subsidies. It doesn't make economic sense. So that's number one. The second part was that it's not just, basically it wasn't just about deficit. It was just about the fact that there is no money there. And in fact, because they were not able to pay the subsidies, it was deducted at source. So the Nigerian National Oil Company that was working with oil manufacturers, oil majors to export oil, basically they do this oil for oil swaps. Basically, we give you crude, you bring in refined petroleum products.
Right.
And for that, then you deduct the cost, including the cost of subsidy. So what it means is that huge billions of dollars that are supposed to accrue to the federation account was lost to subsidy at source. The money just wasn't paid to the federation account because of subsidy. So there was that. The final piece was, again, as mentioned, corruption. The question is that there are all kinds of numbers being bandied around the country, that about 54 million liters of fuel is consumed daily in the country. 54 million liters.
Right.
And this is the basis for which subsidy is calculated. So now the question is that because it is not market driven, because it is there is a lot of opportunity to export because of the price cap. So people will import fuel cheaply because of the price cap. They will sell it to neighboring countries for a premium. And people were making a hell of money out of that. And so it was just not sustainable. It was making some people richer. It was really prone to corruption, right. And it was not. It was physically devastating for the economy. So these were the reasons why it had to go according to the government. And indeed, economically, it makes sense. But of course, it has consequence. And I think that's where the problem is.
All right. We are going to take a short break, and we will be looking at the social networks when we come back. When we come back as well, we will look at some options African governments may have to lower the cost of fuel and, by extension, the cost of living. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Edwin Ikworia, Kanyisa Pika, and Dr. Job Omagwa. Before the break, we looked at the impact the removal of fuel subsidies is having on African countries. Let's now look at some alternatives African governments may have to keep the cost of the fuel down. Kanyisa, have governments, though, in your view, done enough to limit the impact of the removal of fuel subsidies on the society?
Well, I think, governments try to do as much as they can, depending on where they are in the election process. And you'll find that it becomes more creative when it's closer to election time. Countries such as Mozambique, they've tried to, introduce transportation vouchers to be able to still, because, it is about cushioning that blow or economic blow to consumers, right? And also anchoring that inflationary pressure that comes with runaway fuel inflation. So I think there's different ways that governments can explore how to, manage the removal, the gradual phasing out of these subsidies. One of those is to, have an investment structure that will support how they invest in infrastructure and other transport-related areas, and be able to subsidize mainly on the agricultural side, because, high fuel costs tend to always be carried through to consumers through consumer goods that are purchased. And when you're able to support that and be able to invest in related sectors, I think it would make it gradually easy to make the transition through renewable energy resources and have a solid and committed energy mix that can support an economy, so that you don't necessarily have to rely only on fossil fuels. And I think, globally, even rich countries still have these fuel subsidies. So we're not saying the removal has to be abrupt. It has to be gradual, and it has to be communicated well, so that the private sector can also step into investing in those sectors that can actually support goods production and the transportation thereof.
Dr. Omagwa, you're watching what's happening in Kenya. Let's look at some of those alternatives that Kayisa is mentioning. Are there alternative policy measures or some strategies that can be implemented to address this particular affordability of energy, as well as bring down the cost of living, which is, becoming a byproduct, an impact of the removal of fuel subsidies?
The Kenyan government is putting in place several measures to try and cushion, especially those whom they refer to being at the lowest end of the pyramid, by coming up with so many friendly measures to try and cushion them from the harsh economic times. And one is to ensure that, especially since most of them are into agriculture, and by the way, agriculture contributes about 21% of the Kenyan's GDP, as per the economic survey for 2023. Once the production inputs are well cushioned by giving them tax incentives, rebates, and the likes of fertilizer subsidy, you expect that the cost of production will be much lower. In addition, governments will also opt for other alternative measures of cushioning the citizens. In the education sector, for instance, they will opt to give free primary or free secondary education. That is one way of ultimately ensuring that there is some extra coin in the pockets. When it comes to other sectors like transport, governments are doing something in terms of even introducing public transport, which is owned by government in the long run, especially among cities, to try and cushion the citizens. But ultimately, the problem to do with fuel subsidies, as much as they do away with fuel subsidies, it is very unlikely that most of these governments can actually achieve that objective of ultimately ensuring that the citizens are well cushioned. If you look at the case of Namibia, for instance, when the government did away with the fuel subsidies early this year, the opposition politicians and the civil rights activists actually went to the streets and they had demonstrations. The Kenyan case, there are demonstrations which are all centered around the high cost of living. It has to do much with the problem of rising fuel prices. So at the end of the day, fuel will remain a thorny issue in the flesh for most of these African governments, right, as they seek to improve the economic welfare of most of its citizens.
Right. Edwin, what's your thought?
So I think in terms of alternatives, the question is that can they afford it? Can they afford this subsidy in the first place? If they cannot afford it, they will definitely want to let it go as quickly as possible. But that exactly is the problem. The problem is that many of these countries who are removing subsidies are not doing it gradually. And I think Ayisa mentioned that. It is the gradual removal that would have been less terrible for the poor, such that as you're taking it out, you're replacing it with public services. With the little savings you're gaining, you're putting it in public services. And then people can then, they see the alternative, but they know what they are gaining as well. So in this case, but I think the most fundamental problem, and I think Dr. Magwa mentioned this, is the issue of trust. Can we trust the government today? When you do a survey, Afrobarometer survey, looked at it across the continent, more than 67% of Africans do not trust their government. So when you say you're taking away subsidy, where citizens have already felt that this is the way, this is our share of the national resources, and then you take it away, and they don't really trust that you can really put it to alternative, better uses. So that's one. And these are some fundamental points about what kind of communication happens before you remove the subsidy. In the Nigerian case, the Nigerian Labour Congress was vehemently against the removal of subsidy. Why? Right. Because they felt that the underlying factors to make this withdrawal was not done. For instance, why can't Nigeria refineries work in the first place? So why can you not what do you put first? Do you just remove subsidy, or do you want to try to make sure that the conditions that led to these high prices will be taken care of first? And this is what has been mismanaged. And this is why it's really very difficult to think about alternatives, especially when the fiscal burden is so high. And that's why it's a really being caught between the dead blue sea, or what do you call it? The sea and the hard place. Rock and a hard place. Thank you. So it's a difficult one, but that's the reality we have today. But in summary, a lot of fundamental work needs to happen even in order to make it succeed.
All right. I want to get your final comment and very briefly from all of you, and I'll start off with you, Kayisa. What do you see as the long-term benefits of phasing out fuel subsidies in terms of economic stability and social development in Africa in the long run?
For Africa as a whole, our biggest issue is sustainable economic growth. And you want to get to a position that when we are phasing out these fuel subsidies, governments have the fiscal position to be stable, have fiscal consolidation that allows them to be able to be creative about how they diversify their economies going forward. You want to be able to invest, like Edwin has said, that you want to be able to own your refinery processes, and that's where investment can actually go into, and that in the long run, in fact, will reduce your prices. For a country like South Africa that is a net importer of Brent crude, it does become quite serious that we have a stable economy, even on the political side, because then our dollar exchange rate in fact affects the kind of imports we can get, and you know, you want sustainability over time. But also I think what is important is, as the world moves into an energy mix that affords renewable energy, we need to start thinking about how we can you know, reduce our fuel consumption or fossil fuel consumption, and have those EVs come through, because otherwise then we need to think about when our biggest trading partners like the EU, for example, saying by 2030 they want to phase out any cars that are fossil fuel. A region like South Africa that has an automotive industry that is quite strong, that exports to those markets, will definitely be in trouble in a few years if it cannot diversify its energy mix.
Dr. Magwa, your view?
I think as most of these African countries resort to do away with some of these fuel subsidies, they must not lose sight of the fact that good governments must always endeavor to do that which is good for the majority of its citizens. So as they take away the fuel subsidies, they must always ensure to supplement the citizens by improvement of social welfare programs, healthcare, education, manufacturing, agriculture, amongst others. But yet again, as much as the international crude oil prices keep on rising, fuel will always remain to be a problem, and most of these governments must seek to find a long-term solution to this big problem, which is very, very key, because fuel is a key factor in production, agriculture, transport, among other sectors.
Edwin, on the long-term benefits of phasing out fuel subsidies, very briefly.
Investments. I think the first thing is that if your market is deregulated to the point where there are no price caps, then investors can bring the money in. And if they do that, then we can, like Kanisha said, we can diversify the production base. And that means creating jobs. When you create jobs, then people can afford it, right? So if you take away subsidy, but people are working, people are earning salaries, or they're able to produce, then it will be, the whole economy grows for that. So foreign investment is one key point, but it also affords an opportunity in the long term to create, you know, new sectors, in the sense that once people know that fuel is so difficult, then they can transit, what we call the energy transition. They can transit into other sources of energy. In Nigeria, for instance, there's already a campaign on changing our cars from using fuel to compressed natural gas. Those innovations, so electric-driven public transport system, those kind of diversification itself boosts the economy. So we are hoping that in the long term, this removal will then create this, allow for this diversification, allow for investment to be there, and then we remove all the market distortions that we see.
All right. Thank you all very much for a lively discussion. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Edwin Ikworia, International Development and Policy Advocacy Expert, Kanyisa Fika, Economist with Alexander Forbes Investment, and Dr. Job Omagwa, Economist and Lecturer at the Kenyatta University School of Business. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. Do also catch the show on our YouTube playlist and keep this conversation going, and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, it's goodbye.